A lot of you may be now after coming from Esther's presentation, which talked about a very large scale type of project where she's like impacting the mental health of like these variety of different youth. My project is a little bit smaller scale, so if you're expecting some type of large scale, big impactful thing that's gonna like change how you see the world in some way, you'll be sorely disappointed. But I'll try to offer what I can. So let's get started. My name is Ju Kim. My mentor for this project was it was overseen by Professor Elena Suglia. She did a fantastic job, and the reason why I decided to pursue this topic was simply for the reason of I part of it was just inherent fascination with biology, but two is what I realized is that um I kind of touched upon this in the actual presentation itself, as you see, but it's the realization that of how understudied and how unaware people are of these types of relationships existing in the first place. Because again, the research question for this project as a whole, while it originally started as this attempt in order to sort of ascertain whether or not like human embryos could benefit from these things called endosymbiotic relationships. And those basically what an endosymbiotic relationship is this whole concept of organism living in some type of cell, right? Living in some type of or living in another organism, so to speak. That's that idea, right? And you can sort of see that whole conception here within the endosymbiotic theory, which is the idea that what the cell that we have in our bodies originally was without the mitochondrion, right? Until we obtain that mitochondrion, which is sort of like we sort of like gained that um via endosymbiosis, and like eventually it sort of became the definitive ancestor of eukaryote in that sense, as you see with this diagram. So again, by dictionary definition, this is really important: a symbiotic relationship where one organism lives inside the other. Now again, the question that I posed with this now is this always purely beneficial? And how does it really play a role with like all the different organisms? How does the relationship really work? Because again, like I said, part of the motivation for me for pursuing this project was how was of how understudied this was, and how again not many people even knew about it. So in some ways, think of this as a bit of a and I raising awareness to this topic, raising awareness so that I can get people's imaginations running and to contribute to this discussion within the scientific field. And I did this by translating a study conducted by Bishop concerning yellow spotted salamanders. And so let me sort of like track that train of thought now. So to sort of I guess like in some ways highlight my thought process going in. Much of that was that sort of like let me sort of track how my thought process got to here, because again I gave my motivation that motivates me now currently, but there's also like the initial motivation how I got to this type of topic in the first place, and part of it was just like sitting in biology class and during the photosynthesis unit and hearing what type of a complex process this was. Like the plant takes in the light energy and it like just basically was able to produce its own sugars and oxygen essentially in some ways, right? As well as a little bit of water. And it's such a fascinating and complicated process with so many different layers to it, right? So like and I kind of like this thought where like an organism can produce its own sugars and nutrients really intrigued me in the sense of could humans do this too, right? Now the problem with that, of course, is that I was unfortunately unable to answer that question because it's when I realized how intricate the human cells work and how it all correlates with DNA and all that, and how and how that all plays a role in like basically human bodily functions and what it's allowed to do and what it's not allowed to do. However, other species I found that were vertebrates in ways similar to humans were able to in some ways do photosynthesis. And now the question is, so in some ways, since animals are objects of admiration anyway, why not delve into that? And that sort of led me to this journey again to the yellow spotted salamander. And essentially, it knows how to do photosynthesis. And it's apparently the only vertebrate in the entire animal kingdom to do so. And although one can argue that's a bit of a misleading characterization, because again, what I found was that its photosynthesis synthetic abilities that has when it's in embryo form, right, where it's able to produce its own sugars in some ways and take in sunlight and produce again. and take in sunlight is a result of an endosymbiotic relationship with an algae called Ophelia amblystomatis while it's in embryo form. So that's the interesting part, right? So basically, when I so this is all just sort of like me just type of like going into the research, so which is why again this sort of motivated me to further like convey the intricacies and nuances of this. However, in order to fully understand like the extent of how this works, we sort of do have to like also understand how the exact life cycle of a salamander works and what the yellow spotted salamander really is. And let's face it, amphibians just aren't really like mammals, nor reptiles, nor birds, nor fish, nor cnidarians. They're very distinct and are very quite distinct, even compared to other like members within the animal kingdom. They, possess a set of four legs and a tail, and a mole salamander, basically, a group of salamanders known as advanced salamanders. They possess fully developed lungs, allowing them to be completely terrestrial creatures, despite being super dependent on water, despite, so assuming, again, being somewhat dependent on water, as all salamanders are, because they have like extremely sensitive and moist skin, like all amphibians. In adulthood, a lot of mole salamanders apparently spend most of their life burrowed underground, even though they're like born underwater. And there's a northern species that even hibernate during the winter. But again, that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the yellow spotted salamander, which are a type of mole salamander known for their brightly colored and yellow spots. And again, they're distinct among other salamanders, which is a distinct, again, category on its own. And the reason why, again, is its first stage of the life cycle when it's in its egg, birthed by adults and taken care of for only a few days before being left on their own to hatch. It's in this crucial part where the bonding between the algae, Ophelia amblystomatis, I'll just call it OE, or I'll just refer to as algae from now on, and the salamander happens. Essentially, once the egg hatches, out comes, and after that, after it develops and is able to take in all those nutrients during that phase, out comes the solid salamander larvae, all set with external gills painted with a coloration light brown. In 2 to 4 months, however, the larvae will lose their gills and become juvenile salamanders, able to live as terrestrial creatures before fully maturing into adults. However, the topic of interest isn't, again, the first developmental stage, and the relation it has to algae itself and what exactly the algae does for the salamander's well being. As it what makes the salamander, yeah, again, distinct to the first, I'm just kind of sounding like a broken record here. And apparently, this type of endosymbiotic relationship, the reason why I chose to use this as a way to perhaps answer the question of, oh, are they always beneficial, right? Is because it is seen as like a primary example of one. For example, it's been, I believe, and it's been seen as a primary example for over 120 years within the field of science, essentially. Even though, again, understudied as it is still heralded as, there's still some like a notoriety it still has within the community. And again, the goal of this project was to raise awareness, right? And the way I did that was I essentially did a translational scientific work on a study conducted by Bishop. I believe these two guys called Bishop and Small. I believe that was their names. And that was conducted in 2020. And that study basically covers the impact that this relationship has during in terms of the well-being and the growth of the salamanders uh larvae following the egg stage. And so so basically, let's regroup for a little bit before I proceed to explain the study. Let's um let's try to regroup and try to organize and set us straight here. Basically, one, salamanders is distinct. Two, the reason why I did this was because this is an understudied field and because I found fascination within how photosynthesis worked within potentially work within humans. Three, that led me to a track where, I found that certain salamanders were able to do photosynthesis. Four, I found that salamanders don't do direct photosynthesis and we're simply in the endosymbiotic relationship. Five, this increased fascination with how endosymbiotic relationships work and whether or not they'll always be beneficial. And I use the salamander as the primary example of this, due to the fact that they've been seen as a primary example of this within interspecies endosymbiotic relationship for 120 years. They are indeed the gold standard. Now, as for the study itself, and by the way, if anything this is confusing, I would recommend to post anything to chat so I can clarify some stuff. So the study itself was conducted in 2020. Oh wait, yeah, your hand is raised.
Oh, sorry, that's a 1 minute warning, but please continue.
Okay. The study was conducted by Small in 2020, and it states that sunlight mediates the amount of benefits the algae provides to salamander. In order to see how much sunlight played a role, they had three different groups of embryos reared in three distinct lighting periods. The first group had little to no light, the second group had limited light in 14-hour intervals, and the third group had a consistent 24-hour intake of light. And after a period of time, the study would measure the growth, fitness, and overall well-being of the salamander larvae, while also consistently measuring oxygen levels in the embryos, because of plants like um, plants produce a lot of oxygen, right? And in areas without much light, both the embryo and the algae were found to have a net decrease in oxygen levels due to the combined respiration of both. What this implies, according to the study, is that while the fundamental nature of the relationship itself may be unknown and subject to debate, presence of the algae is an overall increase in size. As for direct benefits for the salmon embryo itself, the study states that the algae gives it a provision of oxygen as well as some CO2, while also filtering out embryo's nitrogenous waste for its own respective use. However, there's a problem. They found that small, they found that embryos were reared with little to no light, indeed had decreased growth and survival rate as expected. However, once they reached the larval phase, the salamander was the same size as its contemporaries who were raised in a period where there was a consistent intake of light. Basically, these relationships aren't purely beneficial for the primary organism. And it's much more complicated than a simple mutualistic relationship, which is, where they both benefit each other, than which is usually like, seen with a lot of other endosymbiotic or these types of relationships, right? So in a way, the reason why I told you all this was so that I can get your imaginations running and see yourselves the wonder of the animal kingdom and the intricacies within and how they all interact with each other. And the result of my project was, I believe, a video, sort of like a mini documentary where I just sort of like highlight all these points and talk about it. And I do go a bit more in depth there. So if you want to check that out, I recommend you to go on my page. Um, thank you very much, and have a nice day, everyone.
Great. Thank you
Sorry
so
for the
much.
messy structure.
No worries. It's very interesting. Um, so what was like the most surprising thing that you learned through your research?
Well, I mean, I kind of highlight that at the end, where again, I thought like initially it was going to be a purely mutualistic relationship, right? Where it's like,
Mhm.
oh, well, it's just going to purely benefit them. But actually, it's more nuanced than that. It's some ways it benefits them, but in some ways it also handicaps them. That's kind of the implication, and it really depends also on like the what type of condition they're in. Like for example, in an area with like it depends a lot on what type of condition they're in, for instance, as well. Like just because they have a lot of light to help them with the photosynthesis does not necessarily mean that salamander will be healthier, which was very surprising to me.